Welcome to another episode of the Bible Feed podcast. We're doing another overview of a biblical book today. We've done quite a few in the Old Testament, and then we've done just, I think, only one in the New Testament so far. So this is another New Testament biblical book overview. As in previous episodes like this, we try and fit the book in the overall biblical story. We examine the structure. We try and find out some key themes, maybe take a deeper dive or two. And the idea is we really try and get a hold of what the writers were trying to communicate as a whole. That's the idea. So today we're going to be looking, well, actually, not just one book of the New Testament, but three. And it's the letters of John. So Laurence, you're here with me. We're going to try and work out what these letters mean. So welcome, Laurence.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
It's good to have you, Laurence.
Thanks.
So letters of John. Where are we talking about in the biblical story?
Yeah, so you mentioned that we're in the New Testament, but in terms of time, we are in the first century, and we're deep into that first century, deep into the apostolic era that we find there. Lots of missionary journeys had already happened, churches had been established, and things were growing. Christianity was growing. So that's where we are in the Bible.
So that gives us immediately a little bit of the historical background, I suppose, in general terms. Do we have any more particular sort of historical background for these three letters?
Yeah, so, I mean, when you look at the commentaries about these letters, you get a series of probablys. So some of these things we can't be absolutely certain about. We get a series of probablys. So in terms of like who the author was in our Bibles, it says 1 John, 2 John, 3 John. So somebody called John did it. And we presume that, with probably very good reason, that this is the same John that wrote the Gospel, mainly because there's some striking similarities between the contents of these letters and the Gospel. Even some of the language that's used, talking about faith and belief, which is a huge subject of the Gospel. So in terms of that first probably, it's probably John, the Gospel writer. Another probably is that they are late first century. So we can't exactly nail down the date, but we know that people like Polycarp cited 1 John, and he was around about 100 AD. So we're probably in the 90s AD is when these were written. And then in terms of who they were to, it's not absolutely explicit who these were to, but it's thought that this was probably a circular letter, as some of the other letters were. So we see a very simple statement in the second chapter of 1 John. It says, "My little children, I am writing these things to you that you may not sin." So the reason that John was writing this was in order to help a community in churches in probably across Asia to not sin. But then even more specifically, if we were looking at the context of why this was written, not from a historical point of view, but more from what the situation in those churches were, we see various references to something called the Antichrist. And, mystical thing, it's fairly evident that was a group of believers or people who had been hanging around in the church and had either caused problems and left. 2 John 18, "Children, in the last hour, as I have heard, that Antichrist is coming. Now many of the Antichrists have come, therefore we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us." And then these things are brought out in the next letter as well. So in 2 John it talks about deceivers and antichrists and then how to deal with them. So it was probably a group of people who were causing a bit of a bother in those early churches.
Yeah, okay. So that's really helpful to see a bit of a link there as well then between the first letter and, well, at least the second letter of John. And I think we'll hopefully go and see that 3 John has something similar as well. Okay. So lots of probablys, things are a bit ambiguous, but there's a general background to maturing Christian churches later on in the apostolic era with various issues that they're dealing with. Okay. So let's start with 1 John, and let's think about structure. Is there any kind of discernible structure in this letter?
First of all, it's a letter. It's obviously a letter because it says, "I'm writing this to you. My little children, I'm writing these things to you."
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But it's one of the strangest letters that I've ever seen in terms of its structure. So if when you write a letter, because 1 John is in our Bibles between 2 Peter and I think is it Jude? This is the one after? Yeah, so Jude is the one after the letters. Both of which, if you look at how they're written, they have a greeting at the beginning. So they say things like, hello, Simeon Peter, a servant of the Apostle Jesus, and I'm coming along to talk to you about X, Y, and Z. And then at the end of them, they have some final words and say, be good and look after yourself, etc. But 1 John is very much not like that. So look at the way that 1 John starts. That which is from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life.
That was good, Laurence. You're rivaling David Suchet in his NIV reading.
I haven't got the stamina.
Get you an
I haven't got the stamina for that.
Well, you've done one verse, or half of a verse.
That's right. With the letter structure, we usually have an ending, and like we said with those other letters. And the last verse, it's a strange little verse, which we see finishing this letter. Little children, keep yourself from idols.
Okay.
So it's a very strange structure in terms of a letter.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking that idols, he hasn't really been talking about idols, has he? At least in the rest of the letter, the word hasn't come up, I think.
No.
So, that's really, it is really strange, isn't it? Just to suddenly say that at the end.
Yeah, and I think you have to look into some of the other themes that crop up to try and connect the dots with that last verse. That, we'll come on to this a little bit. The fact that he's referencing back to Old Testament stuff and other things which might be taking their time and energy. The fact that these antichrists, which might be leading them away, So not necessarily in idols in the conventional sense of getting a bit of wood and carving something, but maybe something else. So yeah, it's a strange structure. And then just to finish that there's kind of 2 points to kind of raise around the structure. And there seem to be themes that are wrapped around 2 things and 2 descriptions of God. So we have God is light and we have God is love. And so, in terms of the structure, it's massively ambiguous and lots of themes which just wrap around these 2 core statements. God is light, God is love.
That's really interesting. I think every one that we've done of these sorts of episodes, we've seen how important it is to sort of outline the structure. And it's perhaps been a bit more conventional in the other ones we've looked at. But here, there's a structure, but it's very different. It's almost these interwoven themes that run throughout the book. So that's what I think you're saying. So, so how do we find the themes, or how? Let's sort of dig into this a bit more, I suppose. Yeah. What themes are they?
Yeah. So we see this kind of non-linear repeating of the same types of things, the same themes. Okay. So some of those might be love and hate, light and dark. So that comes up a couple of times throughout. And interestingly, that's one of the little indicators that this might also be the same John from the Gospel of John, because those stark contrasts, the kind of the black and white type contrast is then a theme that we see in the Gospel of John. So love and hate, light and dark is something that we see. We also see the theme of keeping the commandments. That comes up a number of different times, and it's kind of like it cycles through these things and it comes back to keep the commandments, obey the commandments, and then it'll go on to another couple of things, and it's sort of structured around this kind of sort of roller coaster of the same themes. So let's have a look at that theme of keeping commandments and just see where it crops up in this first letter. 1 John 2 verse 3 and 4 first of all. So we've already said that I'm writing to you to make sure you don't sin. So sinning is breaking a command. So we're kind of in the right place.
Okay. And by this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him.
Yeah, so truth and falsehood is, again, another theme. Mm-hmm. And this idea of keeping commandments is something that repeats a couple of times. So let's scan down to verses 8 and 9. What do we read there?
At the same time, it's a new commandment I'm writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. Whoever says he is in the light and hates his brother is still in darkness.
Yeah. So again, now relating the same thing to love and hate and keeping, how do you relate to your brothers? And again, that's then a dotted line all the way to 2 John and 3 John, because, here is the theory, but you're going to hear from me a bit about the practicalities in a minute. And then there's loads of others, but let's just finish with the one in the last. You think, develop your story. Like when you're doing your, my daughter's doing her English exams at the moment, beginning, middle and end. Develop your themes. Well, let's go to the very last chapter. It's pretty much banging on about the same thing. So let's have a look in verse 3 of chapter 5.
Okay, so chapter 5, verse 3. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome.
There we are. So we're bringing together the theme of the love of God. So we've got to the love section of the letter, and again he repeats, keep my commandments. So this is what I mean by, you've got these kind of two pillars of light and love that are kind of stakes in the ground, and then wafting around those two stakes are these themes of keeping commandments, light and dark, confidence, lies and truth, love and hate, antichrist, forgiveness. All of these things are just circling around these two pillars.
So it's almost like an immersive experience, isn't it? Rather than just a strict sort of reading, a series of statements that you to kind of assent to, and as it were, or reading a story, or reading a piece of sort of rhetoric, like Paul's letters are sort of very rhetorical arguments, aren't they? But this is very much, you're sort of just sitting in these statements and these ideas and these really repeated themes that come through. Is there any way we can sort of make more sense of this as well? What is there that can help us sort of dive deeper in with these themes?
So as I hinted at before, there's links back to the Old Testament here. And one way that you can think about 1 John at least, and I think probably 2 John and 3 John, is it's the Torah with a twist. So this is looking at the things that happened in the first 5 books of the Bible, which we've just finished doing our overview and are now available for listening to. So it's the Torah with a twist. So I'll give you an example. If we look at right at the beginning of 1 John, it starts in a very similar way to the Gospel of John, which is all about creation. It's all about light and darkness. And that takes us all the way back to Genesis. So this is taking us back to the first book of the Torah. And like the first book of the Torah, things go pretty badly wrong, and we have sins occurring in the garden which have pretty big implications for mankind. And in 1 John we have that highlighted as well. So it talks about us saying, if we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. So it's basically saying you're all sinners. And so we're right deep back into Genesis. We're following the same story track as Genesis. Things have been created, light and dark, but now this mankind is on the scene and they are sinners. But in this case, we now have a twist. In chapter 2, verse 1, we now have an advocate. So the advocate is with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous. And so we have, almost like links back to the storyline of the Torah, which they would have known about, and this repeated failure of mankind that you can track through those books. But here we have it being presented, but then there's a difference. It's the twist. And the twist is Jesus is our advocate. This is what you should be thinking about. And, man is in a pickle. There is a resolution to that. It's Christ.
That is really interesting. And it's probably a shameful reflection on me, actually, that when I think of 1 John, or this letter particularly, or maybe the 3 letters, I don't instinctively think of them as being heavily rooted in the Old Testament. Perhaps that's just, not being familiar with them particularly as much as other parts of the New Testament say. But it seems right from the start there is a real heavy reliance on Old Testament, on Jewish culture and thought, and going back to the Hebrew Scriptures. Yeah. And expounding them, interpreting them in the light of Jesus.
Exactly right, Dan. That is exactly the point. It's interpreting them in the context that Jesus has now come. That's a really good way of putting it. Because if you look at another example, you have this repeated theme of the commandments. And so just in that second chapter, and we've read it already, that little section, if you keep his commandments, it talks about keeping his commandments. Okay, like if you were to go anywhere in the Bible and say, right, I'm giving you a phrase, keep commandments, where do you go? Like, where do you go in the Bible?
You would instinctively think of the law, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
Yeah, you'd go back to the Torah.
So I would go back probably to Deuteronomy 6 or 5 and 6, like the commandments are being given. Keep my commandments is like a repeated theme of Deuteronomy. But then we have a twist. So we have, not only do we have the Deuteronomy, but we have Deuteronomy with a twist. So you see that then in 7 and 8, where it says, "Beloved, I am writing to you no new commandment, but an old commandment that is from the beginning. The old commandment, that is the word that you have heard. At the same time, it is a new commandment that I am writing to you." Why is it new? Because it's in Jesus. And so that, well, the point you made there was, it's like reinterpreting it with the context of Jesus is really important. So like the commandments of love had been there forever. Well, they've been there through Deuteronomy. But now this is an old commandment, but like it's also a new, because Jesus is on the scene. So here we have Torah with a twist.
Good. It sounds like a new ice cream or something, doesn't it? No, that's great. Okay, so yeah, Jesus has come. He's shown people how to live Torah. He's shown people how to fulfill Torah. This is the ultimate expression of it. Which probably, I mean, we've not done an overview of John's Gospel yet, but I can hear a few passages, a few verses from John's Gospel in my head as I sort of speak this, full of grace and truth. The law came from Moses, which was a good thing. This was a grace, this was a gift, but the grace and truth, the ultimate expression of that is shown in Jesus, which isn't saying that God gave them a bad law, but he's showing them perfectly how this law is really shown and fulfilled. Yeah,
so I think maybe just to wrap that bit up in terms of like how you would interpret those themes and how you would apply them, and this link back to the Old Testament, because there are then some ideas and characters that you get in 1 John in order to prove a point. So when it talks about brothers hating each other, the first example of that is Cain and Abel. And so you get this phrase in 1 John 3 verse 11, "And if we should be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother, why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised." So you've got this introduction of like an example of how brothers hate each other, and where does that come from? So not only are you introducing characters from the Old Testament in order to prove those points, it's introducing this predicament in man's nature, which is the evil one. And the evil one crops up again in chapter 5, verse 18. So again, this is close to the end of the letter. He's giving some exhortation here. "We know that everyone has been born of God, does not keep on sinning, but he who is born of God protects him, and the evil one does not touch him." So there's this evil one thing that's been talked about. And it's already kind of given us a hint where to go and look for that. It says, go and have a look at the beginning of the Bible, Cain and Abel, and that's in Genesis 4, verse 6. And Genesis 4, verse 6 is basically the first example of the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent in action.
So when you say seed of the woman, seed of the serpent, you're talking about Genesis 3:16, aren't you? And effectively the prophecy that God gives after the rebellion of the man and the woman, Adam and Eve.
Yeah, so we have this brotherly contention. So Cain and Abel are both asked to offer, and the offering of Abel was accepted, probably because he was doing it for the right reasons. The offering of Cain was not accepted, probably because he was doing it for the wrong reasons. And in Genesis 4 verse 6, the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? And why was your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." And so there's that character that we see, the evil one character that we see in 1 John. So there's like a hyperlink right the way back, and it's used Cain and Abel as that signpost for us to go all the way back to the Old Testament and say, oh look, themes and ideas from the Old Testament is here, and now we're practically living out a way overcome the evil one, or how to overcome this problem.
Okay, yeah, so Cain murdered his brother Abel, and what John is saying is that in the practical outworkings of church life, you can in effect walk in the steps of Cain if you're not careful. That's what he's saying, isn't he? You can be consumed by this sin thing crouching at the door. It can rule over you. So what we've gone through so far, I can hear sort of some of the resonances between this strange letter with the strange opening, strange ending, and just no real structure to it, and how it connects then with 2 John and 3 John. So 2 John and 3 John, the basic structure, I mean, these sound a little bit more like a letter, don't they? So verse 1 of 2 John, the elder to the elect lady and her children, whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. Verse 3, grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father, from Jesus Christ the Father, Son, in truth and love. I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth. So yeah, you've got a bit more of a letter. You've got at the end, though I have much to write to you, I'd rather not use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to come and talk to you face to face. So this really sounds a little bit more like a proper note. It's a smaller thing. It's written in ink. He'd rather speak to them face to face, but he's got to say something in a letter and send it by Royal Mail.
It's a standard what you would expect from a letter, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But the basic thing in this letter, in 2 John, seems to be that he wants them to keep, verse 6, walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you heard from the beginning, so you should walk in it, which is love one another, which he's just said. So that's exactly what you've just talked about in 1 John. But the reason is, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is a deceiver and an antichrist. And the rest of the letter is basically saying, look, if they come along, they turn up at your church, they turn up at your house, they're asking for money, if they're asking for support, for lodging, to distribute their pamphlets, for them, and help give them public speaking appointments, all those sorts of things that you sort of use your imagination and think through, what would this sort of things these people be asking for? Well, he's saying, well, do not do that. Don't support them. Don't rejoice in their teaching. Don't do those things, because you've effectively taken part in their wicked works if you do that. And like I said before, the background to this is pretty much identical, isn't it, to 1 John, where the many deceivers and the antichrists have gone out. And there's this almost test that we've got to, that he applies. If they come with the teaching of Christ with them, then great, receive them. But if they do not bring this teaching, don't receive them into your house. So
that is a really strong link, isn't there, between that as being a practical application of the stuff that happened that was spoken about in 1 John 4, so talking about the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and is now already in the world. They were, yes, it's already in the world, and then in 2 John, it's actually like a personal letter saying this is how you now deal with it. With that kind of link between theory and practice, what do we know about what they might have been teaching these people who they were to sort of steer away from the door and not rejoice with? What was doing the rounds in those days?
Yeah, so it's back to this verse 7. Those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Okay, that's the word, and that's exactly the same in 1 John 4 as well. So what it's probably referring to is docetism, docetism, however you want to pronounce it. So a docetic Christ is which some people were promoting quite soon after the apostolic, or towards the end of the apostolic era. They were basically saying, Christ was just a being that appeared to be a human, but wasn't actually a real human, wasn't actually in the flesh. It was more sort of, some sort of appearance. So, for example, Craig Keener in the IVP Bible Background Commentary says it might be a docetic denial that Jesus was actually human and actually died. So there's a denial of his humanity and his death. And so John's fighting back at that and saying, look, if anyone can't say that Jesus Christ came in the flesh, then you shouldn't have anything to do with them. Which is really interesting, actually, that any teaching that denies the humanity of Jesus is basically a red flag. That's what I think it's saying. And I just want to transplant ourselves out of this situation just to modern day, and just for a second, if you'll allow me. Generally, you hear people saying, if you deny the divinity of Jesus, then you're not a Christian. And they quite often will turn up these passages, for example, 1 John 4, to basically justify that, and say that, if you deny that Jesus was God incarnate, then you're not a true Christian. But actually, they're saying the very opposite, aren't they? They're saying that if you deny the humanity of Jesus, then you're not really a real Christian. That's what John is saying. And you got to go to other parts of the New Testament to see whether Jesus was both God and human. But certainly in here, it isn't claiming the thing that a lot of Christians will try and put this passage in to use it for. So John, certainly the writer of these letters, he wouldn't receive you, he wouldn't fellowship with you, he won't have anything to do with you or support you if you deny the humanity of Jesus, which I think is the real thing he's getting at. Have we got time for an interesting tangent?
Yeah, let's have a random tangent.
There's a similar thing that happened in 1 John 5, isn't there? Where you get in verse 7 that really infamous verse that is in the King James Bible, but then not in modern translations. It's probably the most certain verse that we know was added by a scribe, which really shouldn't be there. The Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. You know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. And Erasmus basically put that in under duress from the Catholic Church. So that's just fascinating, again, that this sort of Trinitarian idea was inserted into that letter, but really that verse absolutely shouldn't have been there. And often the text really isn't sort of arguing about those sorts of things. It's really got another historical background, like Docetism, for example, in this situation. So, tangent over. So there we go. I
think the point you make there about this being a marker in 2 John verse 7, you know, the way that we learn from this is if you hear stuff that sounds a little bit like this, then your hackles should go up. Now, in this case, it was an actual real thing that was happening. There was a divergence from the truth that had been preached by the apostles that had been given to them by Christ. And the very fact that we're here in like 90s AD, so we're probably about 60 years after Jesus, and already you have got people saying that Jesus actually wasn't really around, and he was not, he wasn't there in the flesh. And so you can see, can't you, why that could develop over time and become something even more detached from the realities of what the apostles spoke about. Okay, so that's 2 John. Let's go on to 3 John. How does that connect with what we've been speaking about?
Okay, yeah. So 3 John, it's only little. You're going to find it's really similar to 2 John, actually. And I think it's brilliant. These two little letters next to each other, and they're almost little mirrors of each other. There's some really interesting features that say that are very similar, even to the point of at the end he says, "I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon. We'll talk face to face." And maybe that's just his standard sign-off signature. But it just invites you then, I think, to put these letters alongside each other and think, okay, so what's the point of this one? So 2 John is basically saying, watch out for some dudes walking around pretending to be Christian, but they are actually not. Don't support them. Well, what's 3 John about? Well, verse 5, "Beloved, it's a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. For they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth." So this is like the opposite of 2 John. Now there's people, wandering preachers and ministers and whoever else, going around and teaching and preaching, and John is now saying, you should support these, and well done for your efforts for these brothers. They were strangers to you, and you should send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. So the point is that John is saying that they ought to receive these sorts of people. And so what you've got is these polar opposites, or these mirror letters here saying, and this is interesting, you've kind of got the light and dark themes in 1 John, haven't you? You've got loving your brother, hating your brother, and if you don't receive these people, then you could end up hating your brother like Cain. You should be showing your love, but actually if you're receiving all the devious preachers who want support and lodgings and fellowshipping with them, but they're actually denying Jesus has come in the flesh, well, then you are actually embracing the darkness. And you can all these little themes that have come up in 1 John suddenly get sort of outworked in a real practical situation, a situation that's different from today. In the days of emails and Twitter and whatever else, and communication is all different, but in a very first century wandering ministers and preachers situation where people just turn up. Well, what are you going to, are these genuine people? What do they know? What do they believe? What are they standing for? And here's a little practical guide, as it were, for living out those real themes in 1 John that flow out of the gospel and the new commandments, and which is an old commandment. They flow out of that, and here's a little guide of how some communities were sorting it out, or were advised and instructed to sort it out in the first century.
Yeah. Fascinating. So the way that you presented it there, it's almost like 2 John. People might be taking a very imbalanced view of applying the things in 1 John. However, you've got the counterbalance of that in 3 John, so that actually you do weigh these two things up and you go, do I test that this person is actually sharing the same faith as me, do I actually share fellowship? And therefore, and the opposite is, well, actually they're not, and I should be, not receiving them. I should be not rejoicing with them. And that's one theme actually we didn't pick out from 1 John, which was this idea of fellowship. And then that idea of actually, if you have the light of the gospel, you therefore have fellowship and share this with the apostles and with other brethren and sisters. And then almost like, well, what do you do about that? Well, that's 2 John and 3 John. If you have that sharing, then go and apply it in 2 John and 3 John examples. Great stuff.
And it's connected to the whole light-darkness theme, isn't it? So, if you are walking in the light, then you have fellowship. So, everyone in the light shares that. And it's just interesting to think about, in Christian circles and Christian communities, it's sometimes really easy to call out the heretic or point to the other and point to those that are spouting nonsense and that you think that they are anyway. But actually, there's this real, importance here to seek out people who are in the light and do that. So if anyone listening is sitting on their own and doesn't have that, really it's so important and so helpful to you to seek out church communities and be together with people who are walking in the light. And it's never going to be a perfect situation or a perfect church, because that's exactly what the situation we see worked out in these letters, a practical sort of messy real life situation, but being together to serve each other is what John is talking about.
Yeah. And I think with this practical application here, we also maybe see the beginnings of things like the, didache, with where you've got communities sort of documenting the way in which they implement some of these theological points that they would read in the apostles like that. Obviously, that document's not inspired, and it was man's attempt to try and implement. Yeah, interesting.
That's right, rooted very much in these letters, I think, in other parts of the New Testament. So, cool, okay, right. So we're getting to the end. Are there any sort of other useful connections to different parts of the Bible that are worth talking about?
Yeah, and I think when you're going through all these three, just have your Torah with a twist detector out and see if you can spot any of those Old Testament links, but also links with the Gospel of John too. Just one of those themes is about bearing witness. Like one of the things in John 21, right at the end of the Gospel of John, it says, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, that we may know that his testimony is true." And go and have a look in 1 John, like the number of times it says, we know, and witnesses, like 1 John 5 about the 3 witnesses that we're messed about with, but the 3 witnesses are spirit, water and blood. And so these things witness to the truth of something. And so go and have a look at that link with the Gospel of John as well. What would you recommend to listeners about reading these letters for themselves? Like what would they look out for?
Yeah, so one thing I think we've tried to emphasise is that this is a different kind of letter. Well, 1 John is a different letter, and then 2 John, 3 John really emphasise how that this should be a practical outworking. There's so many links and themes and thoughts that run through 1 John that you could sometimes get a bit hung up with it and not think about how this should be applicable. But it is really important to do that, to think about how this should affect your life, how this should affect or be applied in your life, in your church, in your community. And so maybe that's something for people to look out for, to sort of sit in 1 John and in all those majestic themes, really think about them, dwell in them, meditate on them, consider how they're applied in 2 John and 3 John, and then really think hard about how you can sort of pick those principles up and apply them in what will be in your life a very different sort of set of circumstances as it will be in my life. But ultimately there's some really good ground rules and guidance and ultimately one new commandment, which really isn't new, it's just an old commandment, but it's been lived out by Jesus himself. So yeah, look out for that and look at how you can take those ideas and put them to your life. There's been quite a few episodes that we've done previously that have popped in my head as we've been reading through this and talking through this. So we've mentioned a little bit about the whole sort of Trinity debate and Jesus' humanity or his divinity and things like that, and there are some Trinity episodes that we've done. If you go to biblefeed.org and search for Trinity, you'll find many of them. there. So there's a few episodes and blogs and things that connect to that. And then we mentioned that verse that was snuck in to 1 John 5, and we have done a 2-part episode on textual criticism, so you can have a look at that as well if that's more interesting to you. And then you did with Paul, didn't you? You did Life in a First Century Church.
Yeah. And we had some random Roman names as well. So
you did. Yeah. That was good, bring it all to life. So there's a few New Testament-based episodes that we've done that link to this. So thanks very much. BibleFeed.org is where you want to go. And you can find us on Facebook as well, and on Twitter. And little children, keep yourselves from idols.
Good point.